Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
You know those family dinners where everyone gathers around the table with plates piled high and glasses clinking in what should be a celebration of togetherness, but beneath the surface simmers a complex web of unspoken tensions, old resentments, and fragile new bonds that can snap at the slightest provocation, and that's exactly how mine unfolded last Thanksgiving in a way that forever altered the dynamics between my son Jake, his new wife Mia, and the rest of us who thought we were just sharing a meal in the cozy warmth of my suburban Chicago home. I'm Evelyn Harper, a 58-year-old woman who has spent the better part of 3 decades building Harper Logistics from a small garage operation into a thriving company that coordinates shipments across the Midwest, ensuring that goods flow smoothly from factories to doorsteps while I've navigated my own life through a messy divorce, raising Jake single-handedly with the kind of determination that comes from knowing no one else will step up if you don't. And on that particular evening, as the aroma of roasted turkey filled the air and candlelight flickered across the faces of my guests, I had no idea that a single careless comment would expose hidden connections and ignite a slow-burning fire of conflict that would test every relationship I held dear. Jake, my 32-year-old son with his easy smile and ambitious spirit working in sales for a fledgling tech firm that often left him scraping by, had married Mia only 6 months prior. A vibrant 29-year-old graphic designer from the bustling streets of Milwaukee who carried herself with the confidence of someone who had always been the center of attention in her circle, her sharp wit and polished appearance making her seem like she belonged in those glossy magazines that promise success to the young and driven. And while I genuinely wanted to embrace her as part of our family for Jake's happiness, there was always that undercurrent of unease, a sense that she viewed me not as an ally, but as some outdated relic from a different era. Her family arrived that afternoon with the kind of enthusiasm that masks underlying stresses, starting with her mother Linda, who bustled in carrying a massive casserole dish filled with her famous green bean bake. Her warm hugs and chatter about neighborhood gossip intended to bridge any gaps, followed by her brother Kyle, a boisterous 30-year-old sports enthusiast who immediately launched into debates about the Bears' disappointing season while cracking open a beer from the cooler. And then there was Tom, Mia's father, a reserved man in his late 50s with weathered hands from decades in the warehousing business, his quiet demeanor speaking volumes about the toll of long hours and financial worries that he rarely voiced aloud. Yet in that moment, as we all settled around the dining table laden with cranberry sauce, stuffing, and pies cooling on the sideboard, I felt a tentative optimism that this blending of our worlds, my steady, hard-working roots intertwined with their more outgoing, urban flair, might just work if we all played our parts with grace and understanding. The conversation flowed easily at first, weaving through topics like holiday traditions and Jake's latest work challenges, with laughter punctuating the stories of childhood mishaps and the occasional clink of forks against plates as we savored the meal that I had prepared with care, drawing on recipes passed down from my own mother who taught me that food could mend what words often broke. But midway through the main course, as the wine loosened tongues and the room grew warmer from the oven's residual heat, Mia leaned back in her chair with a glass of Merlot dangling from her fingers, her eyes scanning the table before landing on me in a way that made my stomach tighten instinctively. And then she raised her voice just enough to command attention over the hum of chatter, declaring loudly while gesturing with her fork toward my plate, "This is the fat pig I told you about," her words slicing through the air like an unexpected gust that scatters leaves, prompting an immediate eruption of laughter from her family, Linda nearly sputtering on a mouthful of beans, Kyle slapping his knee with unrestrained mirth, and even Tom letting out a low chuckle that seemed more reflexive than genuine, leaving me frozen in place with my own fork suspended, the heat of embarrassment flooding my cheeks as I grappled with the raw sting of being reduced to a punchline in my own home, especially since the extra weight I've carried since hitting menopause had always been a private battle, one I'd fought quietly without inviting such public cruelty from the woman who is now my daughter-in-law. The laughter tapered off into uneasy coughs and shifted glances, with Jake shooting Mia a hurried look of disapproval while muttering something about the wine going to her head, but she merely shrugged it off with that dismissive wave of her hand, as if the remark had been nothing more than playful banter among friends, and in the midst of this awkward hush that settled over the table like a heavy fog, Tom lifted his gaze from his nearly empty plate, his expression shifting from amusement to dawning recognition behind the lenses of his wire-rimmed glasses, leaning forward slightly so that his whisper carried only to me amid the lingering clatter of silverware and the distant hum of the refrigerator. "Ma'am, you're my employer," he murmured, his voice laced with a tremor of shock and apology that revealed the layers of coincidence we had all overlooked, because unbeknownst to Mia and the others, Tom had been a reliable night shift worker at my warehouse for the past 5 years, diligently loading pallets and managing inventory with the steadfast reliability that had earned him quiet respect among the team, though I had only ever seen him in his work coveralls under the harsh fluorescent lights. Never imagined him sitting across from me at a family feast in pressed khakis and a holiday sweater. My thoughts raced in that instant, piecing together the fragments. Mia had vaguely mentioned her father's job in shipping during wedding planning, but the company name had never come up, and now here it was. This profound intersection of our lives crashing together in the most unexpected way, leaving me to force a composed nod in Tom's direction while he paled visibly, his fork trembling as he pushed food around his plate. The rest of the evening dissolving into a blur of strained small talk about the weather forecasts and distant relatives' updates, all while I cleared dishes with mechanical precision, my mind churning with the implications of this revelation and the power it suddenly placed in my hands. As the group finally began to disperse into the crisp November night, bundling into coats and exchanging goodbyes that felt hollow under the porch light, Jake pulled me aside for a quick embrace, whispering hurried apologies for Mia's so-called joke and promising it wouldn't happen again. But as I watched their taillights fade down the quiet street, the whisper from Tom echoed relentlessly in my ears, stirring a potent mix of hurt, curiosity, and the first sparks of resolve to uncover just how deep these family ties ran and whether I would let this moment define me as the victim or empower me to reshape the narrative in ways they could never anticipate, because in the quiet of my empty house that night, with the remnants of the feast still scattered on the counters, I realized that silence might be my sharpest tool, one that could either heal the wound or widen it into something far more consequential for all of us involved. Lying awake in the dim glow of my bedside clock that first night after the Thanksgiving fiasco, with the house settling into its familiar creaks and the faint scent of leftover turkey still lingering in the air from the kitchen below, I replayed every excruciating detail of Mia's cutting remark and the ensuing laughter that had echoed off the walls like a mocking chorus, feeling the weight of it all pressed down on my chest as I wondered how a single meal could expose so many vulnerabilities in the people I cared about most, especially since Jake, my son who had always been my anchor through the storms of single parenthood after his father walked out when he was just 10, now seemed caught in a web of loyalties that pulled him away from the straightforward bond we had built over years of school events, late-night talks about his dreams, and my relentless support for his every step toward independence in a world that often favored the flashy over the steadfast. The morning light filtered through the curtains eventually, coaxing me out of bed to brew a pot of coffee strong enough to cut through the fog of resentment clouding my thoughts, and as I sipped it black while scrolling through faded photos on my phone, images of Jake as a lanky teenager at his high school graduation, me beaming beside him in the cap and gown photo booth, or the two of us hiking the trails around Lake Michigan during summers when money was tight but our connection unbreakable. I couldn't shake the image of him that evening, his face flushing with discomfort as he tried to deflect Mia's barb with a weak joke, revealing how her influence was already reshaping the family dynamics I had nurtured so carefully, making me question whether my efforts to welcome her had blinded me to the subtle snobbery she carried like a designer handbag, always appraising others through a lens of urban sophistication that dismissed the grounded life I had forged in the suburbs. Work provided the necessary distraction that week, immersing me in the steady rhythm of Harper logistics where dispatch schedules needed tweaking for holiday delays and inventory reports demanded my attention in the cluttered office that overlooked the sprawling warehouse yard. Yet even there, Tom's presence loomed large in my mind as I caught glimpses of him through the window, His broad frame bent over pallets under the relentless buzz of forklifts, his movements deliberate but now tinged with an awareness that our paths had crossed in ways he never intended, prompting me to avoid direct interaction while quietly reviewing his personnel file that highlighted his impeccable attendance record alongside notes on the physical strain of his role. A man who had clocked in faithfully for 5 years without complaint, despite the creeping aches from a lifetime of manual labor that mirrored the invisible burdens I carried as the boss holding it all together. Jake reached out midweek with a phone call that came during my lunch break, his voice carrying that tentative edge it always did when navigating tricky conversations, admitting that Mia had been venting about work pressures from her freelance design gigs that weren't panning out as hoped. And while he apologized again for the dinner incident, framing it as a one-off fueled by too much wine, I detected the undercurrent of defensiveness in his tone, as if he were already aligning more with her worldview than the one I had instilled in him about treating people with the respect they deserved regardless of appearances or bank accounts, leading me to suggest we meet for lunch at our old haunt, the no-frills diner on the edge of town with its vinyl booths scarred from years of use and bottomless cups of mediocre coffee that had witnessed countless heart-to-hearts over the past decade. Sitting across from him in that familiar spot, watching him pick at his club sandwich while explaining how Mia's family had always communicated in blunt terms that sometimes crossed lines but came from a place of tough love, I felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with frustration as he casually mentioned their house hunting struggles in the competitive Chicago market where starter homes vanished faster than inventory at a Black Friday sale. And that's when the seed of my first subtle retaliation took root, a petty but pointed maneuver born from the hurt still festering inside me, prompting me to offer co-signing their mortgage application with the outward generosity of a mother eager to help her son start his family, knowing full well that my involvement would trigger a credit check revealing the inconsistencies in their finances, Mia's erratic freelance earnings juxtaposed against Jake's modest salary, which could quietly inflate their interest rates and force them to confront the realities of their choices without me ever raising my voice or pointing fingers. He accepted with genuine relief, lighting up his features, pulling me into a quick hug across the sticky table. That spoke of his lingering affection despite the growing divide, but as I drove back to the office with the winter sun glinting off the snow-dusted roads, a wry sense of satisfaction settled over me at the thought of this invisible nudge. A clever twist on family support that echoed the laughter from dinner in its understated sting, making Mia perhaps pause before dismissing anyone else as less than worthy in her polished narrative of success. The days blurred into a routine of meetings and memos until late one afternoon when my desk phone interrupted the quiet hum of the office, the caller ID flashing Tom's name from the employee roster that I had pulled up earlier out of curiosity. And, answering it with a steady voice despite the flutter in my stomach, I heard his gravelly tone laced with hesitation as he began by acknowledging the awkwardness of our shared secret, explaining that Mia remained clueless about his employment at my company and often exaggerated stories to impress her social circle, but then his words shifted to the mounting pressures at home where medical bills from Linda's health scare the previous year continued to drain their savings, compounded by whispers of shift reductions across the industry that threatened his steady paycheck, his plea hanging in the air like a fragile thread connecting our two worlds, forcing me to navigate the fine line between empathy for a hard-working father and the righteous anger still simmering from being the butt of his daughter's joke. As I assured him of potential overtime opportunities while inwardly grappling with whether this vulnerability was an opening for deeper reconciliation or merely the prelude to complications that could ensnare Jake and the unborn grandchild in ways none of us had foreseen, leaving me to stare out at the warehouse lights flickering on as dusk fell, pondering if extending a hand now would extinguish the fire of resentment or merely fan its flames into something uncontrollably fierce. As December descended upon the Chicago suburbs with its blanket of twinkling holiday lights strung across neighborhood lawns and the crisp air carrying the scent of pine from wreaths adorning front doors, I found myself navigating the delicate balance between maintaining the facade of familial harmony and the undercurrents of resentment that Tom's unexpected call had stirred up like sediment in a long-settled glass, prompting me to delve deeper into the intricacies of Mia's family dynamics. through the lens of my professional oversight at Harper Logistics, where access to personnel records revealed layers of hardship I hadn't anticipated, such as the mounting medical debts from Linda's cancer treatments the year before that had forced Tom to pick up extra shifts despite his worsening knee pain, all while Mia positioned herself as the upwardly mobile success story in their circle, oblivious to how her father's quiet sacrifices underpinned the very stability she took for granted in her freelance pursuits. Jake and Mia decided to host a modest holiday gathering at their compact apartment overlooking the bustling Loop, framing it as a gesture of reconciliation after the Thanksgiving debacle with invitations extended to a handful of close friends and family members, including me. And though part of me hesitated at the thought of stepping back into their space, where Mia's judgmental gaze might once again appraise my every move, I chose to attend dressed in a simple yet flattering wool ensemble that I hoped conveyed quiet confidence rather than the vulnerability she had so casually exploited before. Arriving amid the soft glow of string lights draped over the modest Christmas tree and the aroma of spiced cider wafting from the kitchen where Mia moved with purposeful grace, her laughter ringing out as she played the gracious hostess to guests who admired her curated decor and vibrant energy. The evening unfolded with an initial veneer of warmth, conversations meandering from the latest office holiday parties to predictions for the coming year, while Jake hovered nearby with a proud arm around Mia's waist, his eyes meeting mine occasionally in silent reassurance that things were improving. But as the crowd thinned and the intimate circle included only our families, Carl sidled up to me near the charcuterie board laden with artisanal cheeses and crackers, his casual inquiry about my trucking business laced with a probing curiosity after overhearing Mia's offhand complaints about old-school operations, prompting me to respond with measured enthusiasm about how the industry kept the nation's supply chains humming and how loyal workers like those on the warehouse floor deserved recognition for their backbone role, subtly alluding to Tom's diligence without naming him and planting the seed of intrigue in Kyle's mind as he nodded thoughtfully before drifting back to debates on the Bulls' playoff chances. Tom arrived fashionably late, slipping in with a bottle of inexpensive wine clutched in his calloused hands and taking a seat in the shadowed corner of the living room where he nursed a single beer throughout the night, our brief eye contact conveying a mix of gratitude for the overtime I had discreetly approved and the lingering awkwardness from his revelation, which I parlayed into my next calculated step of retaliation by assigning him a seemingly innocuous task the following day at work, overseeing a routine inventory audit that required documenting minor discrepancies in shipment logs, a harmless duty on the surface, but one that exposed the everyday inefficiencies he had previously glossed over to protect his team, effectively putting him under a gentle spotlight that forced accountability without outright punishment and served as my witty payback for his initial chuckle at Mia's expense, watching from my office window as he pored over clipboards with renewed focus, the pressure a clever reminder of the interconnectedness he had overlooked. The true emotional pivot came later in the evening when Mia drew me into a quieter moment by the window overlooking the city skyline twinkling like distant stars, her tone softening as she broached the topic of Thanksgiving with an apology framed around her stressful workload and the wine's influence, admitting that her bluntness sometimes got the better of her in attempts to bond through humor. And while I accepted her words on the surface with a nod and a light comment about how we all had our rough edges, inwardly I marveled at the irony of her vulnerability now that a quick review of company emails had uncovered more about her family's strains, including how Tom's job stability directly impacted their ability to support her ambitions, turning what could have been a genuine olive branch into another layer of leverage I held close to my chest. Jake joined us then, his face alight with uncontainable excitement as he announced their pregnancy due in the spring, pulling me into an embrace that bridged the gap of recent tensions and filled the room with a tentative joy that momentarily overshadowed the undercurrents, though as I congratulated them and felt the flutter of what would be my first grandchild, a dilemma crystallized in my mind since the cosign loan now carried amplified risks with a baby on the way and Tom's recent performance tweaks could ripple into broader family fallout if not handled delicately, making me question whether my path of subtle Manipulations was protecting my dignity or eroding the trust Jake still placed in me as the steady figure from his childhood. The party wound down with guests bundling against the chill as they stepped out into the snowy streets, but before I could make my exit, Mia's phone buzzed insistently on the coffee table, drawing her into a hushed conversation with Tom on the other end, whose voice carried fragments of concern about an unexpected issue at home, and as she hung up with a furrowed brow, confiding in me without realizing the full context that her father's job woes were resurfacing just when they needed stability most, I offered vague assurances drawn from my insider knowledge while driving home through the flurries that dusted the windshield, the weight of impending revelations pressing heavier as Jake's joyful text about the baby illuminated my dashboard, leaving me to contemplate if Mia would soon piece together the whispers circling her family and confront me directly, unleashing a storm that could either forge unbreakable bonds or shatter them beyond repair in the fragile holiday afterglow. January ushered in with the kind of biting cold that wraps around the Midwest suburbs like an unwelcome guest, turning every breath into a visible puff and every driveway into a slippery challenge that mirrored the icy chill settling deeper into the relationships I had once thought resilient enough to weather any storm, particularly as the news of Jake and Mia's impending arrival in the spring amplified the stakes for all of us, forcing me to confront how my calculated nudges at work and in family matters were beginning to weave a tangled web that threatened to ensnare not just Mia's pride, but the very foundation of trust between me and my son, who had always looked to me as the unshakable pillar in his life. Work at Harper Logistics consumed my days with the minutiae of a potential merger that promised to expand our routes into neighboring states, involving endless conference calls and spreadsheet reviews that kept my mind occupied yet allowed stray thoughts to drift back to Tom's personnel file, where recent entries noted his exemplary handling of the inventory audit I had assigned as a subtle prod, his reports now meticulous to a fault in a way that hinted at the underlying stress of balancing family secrets with job security. All while I wrestled internally with the moral ambiguity of using my position to exact a measure of payback that felt justified in the quiet hours, but increasingly hollow when considering the ripple effects on innocent lives like Linda's ongoing health battles or the grandchild who would enter this fractured dynamic without choosing it. The decision to host a casual Sunday brunch at my home came from Jake's suggestion during one of our strained phone check-ins, positioning it as a low-key way to celebrate the pregnancy milestone amid the winter drabness with promises of fresh quiche, fruit platters, and the kind of easy conversation that could mend fences before the baby shower planning ramped up and the skepticism gnawed at me about Mia's willingness to drop her guard in my territory. I agreed and spent the morning in the kitchen chopping vegetables with a precision that channeled my simmering frustrations into something productive. The sizzle of bacon in the pan a small comfort against the uncertainty brewing as I set the table with my best linens and a centerpiece of evergreens scavenged from the backyard to evoke a touch of warmth in the frost-laced air. They arrived in a flurry just past 11, Mia moving gingerly with her early bump concealed under a loose sweater and her family trailing behind, Linda bearing a tray of cinnamon rolls with apologies for the store-bought variety due to her fatigue from treatments, Call diving straight into the sports section of the newspaper spread on the counter while debating the Cubs' off-season moves, and Tom hanging back with a quiet greeting that carried the weight of our unspoken pact, his eyes darting to mine in a silent acknowledgement of the overtime perks that had eased his immediate burdens, but at the cost of heightened vigilance on the job floor where whispers about efficiency audits now circulated among the crew. Conversation over the meal started on neutral ground with discussions of nursery themes and pediatrician recommendations, Jake's enthusiasm lighting up the room as he described potential names drawn from family trees on both sides. But the harmony cracked when Mia, perhaps emboldened by the home-cooked spread or the hormones coursing through her, steered the talk toward lifestyle choices with a pointed remark about preferring modern names over anything stuffy and outdated like Evelyn, delivering it with a playful wink that invited chuckles from Kyle and a hesitant smile from Linda, the echo of Thanksgiving's laughter resurfacing in a way that made my grip tighten on my coffee mug as Jake shifted uncomfortably beside me, his silence speaking volumes about the divide widening between his upbringing under my guidance and the sharper edges of Mia's world. seizing the moment for my next layer of retaliation, one that blended professional insight with personal satisfaction in a manner both clever and cutting without crossing into overt meanness. I casually mentioned during a lull in the chatter how Harper Logistics was bolstering its internal creative team to handle branding needs in-house rather than relying on external freelancers, dropping the detail with the offhand air of industry gossip while watching Mia's fork pause midway to her mouth. Her freelance portfolio likely including pitches to smaller shippers in our network that this shift could quietly sideline, embarrassing her ambitions just enough to mirror the public slight she had inflicted on me and prompting a flicker of unease in her expression as she probed for more details under the guise of professional interest. The witty undercurrent of this move satisfying that deep-seated need for equilibrium even as guilt tugged at the edges when Jake shot me a questioning glance. The brunch devolved from there into pockets of tension, with Jake pulling me into the hallway afterward, his voice low and edged with frustration, as he accused me of needling Mia during what should have been a joyful gathering, defending her mood swings as pregnancy-related while admitting her family's financial strains made her sensitive to career threats, a confrontation that forced me to bite back a sharper retort about reciprocity and respect and instead utter a clipped response about boundaries that left him walking away with a shake of his head. His choice to prioritize her narrative over mine isolating me further in the home I had opened to them and stirring a wave of self-doubt about whether my prideful maneuvers were safeguarding my dignity or simply pushing away the son I had raised to value fairness. Above all, Linda attempted to smooth things over with anecdotes from her own early marriage days filled with similar clashes between in-laws, her gentle humor drawing reluctant smiles, but Mia excused herself abruptly to the powder room, the atmosphere thickening like the steam rising from cooling plates. And as the group finally dispersed into the gray afternoon with hugs that felt obligatory under the porch overhang dripping from melting icicles, Tom lingered just long enough to catch me alone by the door, his face etched with lines deeper than before as he confided in a hushed tone about Linda's cancer returning with a vengeance requiring immediate and costly interventions that his benefits barely covered, pleading for any flexibility in scheduling or assistance programs that might keep their heads above water without alerting the family to the full extent of their desperation. His vulnerability hitting me like a gust from the open door and crystallizing the dilemma at my core: extend full mercy and risk absolving Mia's cruelty unchecked, or hold the line and potentially fracture Jake's world irreparably just as the babies do. Date loomed on the calendar. Driving to the office later that evening with stacks of merger documents on the passenger seat and the heater blasting against the persistent chill, my phone illuminated with a terse text from Mia requesting we meet alone soon. Her words devoid of context, but heavy with implication, whether an olive branch, a confrontation, or the unraveling of secrets she had begun to suspect, leaving me to navigate the darkening streets with a knot in my stomach, pondering if this summons marked the tipping point where my carefully laid plans would either culminate in cathartic resolution or cascade into a family crisis far beyond the dinner table origins. February arrived with a tentative thaw that softened the snowbanks lining the Chicago streets, but did little to melt the frost encasing the fragile threads of my family connections. Especially after Mia's cryptic text summoning me to a neutral coffee shop downtown where the hum of midday patrons provided a buffer against the raw confrontation I sensed brewing in her terse message that hinted at suspicions without spelling them out, leaving me to arrive early with a large black coffee in hand, and my nerves taut as I scanned the room for her figure, ultimately spotting her weaving through the crowd in a maternity top that accentuated her growing bump and a determined set to her jaw that recalled the boldness of that fateful dinner remark, but now laced with an undercurrent of uncertainty born from whatever fragments of truth Kyle or Tom had let slip in unguarded moments. She slid into the booth opposite me without preamble, her latte steaming between us as she launched into the heart of it by questioning the odd coincidences surrounding her father's sudden work perks and the subtle shifts in Jake's loan process that had raised their rates just enough to strain their budget, her eyes searching mine for confirmation while admitting that pieces were falling into place like puzzle bits from a conversation overheard between Kyle and Tom about warehouse connections that tied back to my company. prompting me to weigh the merits of full disclosure against the risk of escalating the conflict further into territory that could irreparably damage Jake's trust or even jeopardize the unborn child's entry into a harmonious world. The conversation unfolded in halting waves, her initial defensiveness giving way to a reluctant admission about the origins of her fat pig. Comments stemming from insecurities about her own body changing with the pregnancy and frustrations with her stalling career that made her lash out at perceived symbols of stability like me, the successful businesswoman who embodied everything she aspired to yet felt intimidated by in her more vulnerable moments, and as I absorbed her words, feeling a mix of empathy and lingering resentment that softened the edges of my resolve. I chose to reveal the full extent of Tom's employment under my roof along with the whisper from dinner that had set this chain in motion, watching her face cycle through shock, embarrassment, and a dawning realization of the power imbalance she had blithely ignored while her family chuckled along to her cruelty. She pressed for details on my retaliatory steps, the cosign complications, the design team expansion that nipped at her freelance edges, the performance pressures on Tom that served as my clever barbs without outright harm. And though tears welled in her eyes not from outright remorse, but from the fear of how this could fracture her marriage and upend their plans, I explained it all with a steady voice that masked the internal turmoil of knowing my choices had veered into morally gray areas where pride overrode pure-hearted forgiveness, choices that would likely make anyone listening question if I had become the very antagonist Mia painted me as in her private vents. The fallout accelerated from there with Jake's anguished call that evening, his voice cracking over the line as he pieced together the revelations from Mia's tearful recounting and accused me of weaponizing my authority in ways that toyed with his in-laws' livelihoods and, by extension, his own future stability. Defending Mia's flaws as human while lamenting how my manipulations had eroded the unconditional support he had always counted on from me, a confrontation that left me defending my actions as necessary boundaries against disrespect, yet ending with him hanging up in a silence heavier than any argument we had ever shared, isolating me in the echoing emptiness of my home where the walls seemed to close in with memories of happier times like his childhood birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes and laughter untainted by adult vendettas. Work transformed into a pressure cooker the next week as Tom approached my office door with a hesitant knock, his expression a blend of gratitude for the financial breathing room and quiet betrayal over the strings attached to his raises that had spotlighted family distractions in his reviews. Begging for understanding as he detailed Linda's aggressive cancer recurrence demanding treatments that stretched their resources thin and pleading for any corporate aid that might prevent him from choosing between job loyalty and family survival, his raw plea forcing me to navigate the final twist in my strategy of revenge by greenlighting a new employee assistance initiative I had been mulling over. One that covered medical extensions anonymously, but mandated group counseling sessions to address work-life stressors, effectively extending mercy to his plight while compelling the family, including Mia through Tom's involvement, to unpack their dysfunctions in facilitated talks, where buried resentments like that dinner incident could surface under neutral guidance. A witty culmination of payback that satisfied my sense of justice by turning their laughter into lessons without direct confrontation, and yet carried the underhanded satisfaction of watching them confront the consequences of their casual cruelty on my terms. The true climax materialized at the family mediation Jake orchestrated a few days later in my living room, the same space scarred by Thanksgiving's memory now filled with tense figures gathered around the coffee table. Mia with her hands protectively over her belly, Tom and Linda side by side in weary solidarity, Kyle fidgeting with discomfort, and Jake positioned between us like a reluctant mediator, where accusations flew in controlled bursts from Mia's hurt over the manipulations to Tom's quiet admission of his enabling silence at dinner, my own contributions laid bare in a moment of vulnerability that humanized us all as we navigated tears, tentative apologies, and the shared fear of how this baby would inherit our baggage if left unresolved, leading me to propose the full forgiveness of their loan debts in exchange for committing to the counseling program sponsored through my company, along with Tom's phased early retirement package complete with benefits that secured their future. A gesture that diffused the immediate crisis, with hugs exchanged amid sniffles and promises of better communication. Yet as they departed into the mild evening air with Jake lingering for a heartfelt talk about the complexities of forgiveness and how my path of calculated responses had both protected and wounded us, the ambiguity lingered like a half-formed question in the quiet aftermath. Had I truly healed the rifts by blending mercy with accountability, or merely perpetuated a cycle of power plays that would echo through generations, leaving me to ponder alone with a glass of wine whether the price of my pride had forged stronger bonds or simply bought a fragile peace at the expense of the unfiltered love I once shared so freely with my son.